just turned 6 o'clock, so I will make a start. Good evening, everyone, to everyone in person and to everyone that's online and joining online. Nice to have you along on a Tuesday evening. So this is our final talk of the session of our program of events this year, and we'll be starting again in October. Also, my final meeting as chair of the group, and we're handing over to Fiona, who's in the audience tonight as well. So please come and say hello to us during the course of the evening. So we very much look forward to our talk with Steve McFarland this evening. Very briefly, my usual run through the administration. For any of the audience that aren't members of the Royal Met Society, there's plenty of benefits. Please do join and consider membership if you will. We've got all of our in-house journals, which are listed there, our newsletters, discount at conferences. We've got our annual conference coming up in July, and support grants, etc. So please do check it out on the RMET's website for the benefits of membership. There's not too much. Normally I'd sort of advertise our program coming up, but there's not too much to come as it's the last event of the program so far tonight. So as I say, we welcome Steve McFarland, Dr. Steve McFarland from SEPA tonight to talk to us around flood warning in Scotland. Steve serves as the lead coastal flooding specialist at SEPA, where he plays a key role in monitoring, forecasting and managing coastal flood risk across Scotland, with extensive experience in environmental protection and flood risk management. Professional background includes education at the University of Southampton and practical expertise in coastal engineering and flood mitigation. So we're in the right place to hear all about flooding in Scotland on the East Coast. And before I hand over to you, the final element is first aid. The fire exits are right here for those of us in person, and with no fan fire disruptions. So, without further ado, Steve, hopefully everything's working for you, and over to you. Very welcome.
Very much. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. It's very much appreciated. I hope you'll find something interesting or useful in what I say. As I was introduced there, I'm Steve McFarland and I'm work with SEPA. My role actually is to sit across all of the flooding teams and try and link that coastal flooding element together across our different functions there. So I'm going to start by wishing you happy St. Patrick's Day, and then I'm going to move on and give you a wee bit of what I'm going to cover tonight, or what I'm hoping to cover. Providing a flood warning service, including the coastal flood warning service, takes a lot of people and a lot of effort, and there's a huge number of people involved, so just thanks to all of them. But a special thanks to Colin and Claire at SEPA, who work in the flood forecasting and warning team. They've been there longer than me and have been largely responsible for getting things set up and running the way they are. So special thanks to them. But as I say, I can't thank everyone, but lots of people have contributed a lot to this service over the years. I'm going to give you a wee bit of an overview of SEPA's flood forecasting and warning service, how it works. The data and inputs we use for coastal forecasting, how we generate those coastal flood forecasts and flood warning messaging, and some of the challenges we have now and in the future, including a little reference to climate change. SEPA's responsibilities for flooding are born out of the Flood Risk Management Act, Scotland, 2009. And we split our services across these three themes: avoid, adapt, and warn. So for avoid, we're mainly looking at products like our flood maps that show areas that may be at risk of flooding, and the advice we give to planning authorities. The best way not to be flooded is not to build something in a flood area in the first place, as I'm sure everyone's aware. So it's a really, really important part of the service. Secondly, around adapt and our role in flood risk management planning and coordinating the different organisations that contribute to flood risk management in Scotland. You can see the flood risk management plans online and all the actions that are set out therein. And finally, around warn, this is about warning businesses and the communities about the imminent risk of flooding. And this is what I'm going to obviously focus mainly on tonight. We deliver that largely through our floodline service. Underpinning much of what we do in flood warning is the hydrometric network. Really important part of it is often forgotten. So I can tick a box that I haven't forgotten that tonight, because they are a really, really important part of everything we do. We have other key partners. First of those that I'll pick out is the Scottish Flood Forecasting Service. So this is a partnership between SEPA, who have the expertise in flood warning, and the Met Office in weather forecasting. And that partnership works to bring those two different pieces of expertise together to produce the warnings that will allow people to take an appropriate response to flood warnings and the likes. The second one I'd like to mention, again, maybe not as prominent as the first, is the UK Coastal Flood Forecasting Partnership. So this is a collaboration of all the UK authorities responsible for flood forecasting and warning in the respective regions. So National Resources Wales, ourselves, Department for Infrastructure, Northern Ireland, and the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency, understandably, are the big sort of player in that partnership. And on behalf of the partnership, they tend to procure various products for us, but it is as a partnership. And we draw information and evidence from the Met Office, National Oceanographic Centre, CFAS, the Centre for Fisheries Aquaculture Science, and the British Oceanographic Data Centre. There are a lot of acronyms around flood warning, for which I apologise, and I'll try and pick my way through them as we go along. So drilling down into our flood forecasting and warning service a bit more. So there are really three key products here. We produce a daily flood guidance statement for partners. That's a 5-day outlook for flooding in Scotland. You can see the 5 different little Scotland maps up in the corner. That's 5 days, and the colouring from green to red represents the likelihood and impact that flooding is expected to have over those 5 days. There's a little matrix which you can probably just about see in the map on the bottom, which is used to work those out. And when we have a reasonable chance of some significant flooding, we provide more information in that area of concern box at the bottom. So really important document, issued daily around 10:30 for all our partners to help their planning. Then there's a public-facing version, a 3-day outlook called the Scottish Flood Forecast. And that's issued, as I said, every day, and that's public-facing. On the example there, you'll see a bit of a splurge with a red spot over Aberdeen. Don't worry, this is an historic one. We're not going to get soaked tonight, I don't think so. And finally, the services around floodline. So this is where we carry out our regional flood alert and local flood warning work, and also where briefings and advice to various partners are prepared. Okay, the people behind the service. So I'll take a little bit of time on this one because it is quite important to see how everything links together. This is probably quite a SEPA-centric view of how everything works. So SEPA flood hydrology and flooding staff are in the, I guess, slate grey boxes. Other SEPA people are in the light blue. Our Met Office input comes in the green boxes. The purple blobs are partnerships and organisations we deal with and communicate with, and the orange blobs are our products that are produced. At the top of this is the flood duty manager. who oversees the service on a operationally on a day-to-day basis. Generally, maybe they don't have tremendous amount to do, check that everything's been done. But whenever things really start to kick off, they become a really key player in holding everything together. Yeah, amongst other things, they are the feed into the Scottish Government resilience room, and they work with the SEPA com staff to do our social and media messaging and the likes. They're also responsible for approving the issuing of a severe flood warning. So key player, particularly when things really heat up. A lot of the work is done by the flood forecasting hydrologist, and that partnership with the Met Office meteorologist is really critical in pulling the daily information together and carrying out that combined assessment of what the flood risk for the day and the next few days is likely to be. So really, really key person there. They issue the flood guidance statement and the Scottish flood forecast, and they also issue flood alerts, which I'll come back to in a moment. Sitting alongside them is the duty flood advisor and our resilience officer, and they coordinate communications with all the various partnerships. So I've already mentioned the score at the top. I can't get it out of my head that's Gaelic for a mountain, but anyway. And we have the local resilience partners, the strategic coordination groups, and local authorities. So that all of that is managed through those two people. There are guys who keep the systems up and running, again, very important. And then we have a whole batch of people who go under the title FWDOs, Flood Warning Duty Officers. There are 8 fluvial officers spread along the bottom there, and sitting on top of them is the National Coastal Flood Warning Duty Officer rota. These people are responsible for issuing the local flood warnings. Okay, right, we got through that one. So a couple of other slides I think will be quite useful before we move into things in a bit more detail. Every morning, I think it's generated about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, the Met Office provide us with this outlook for the coast. This has been updated recently and is a really, really useful document for getting a feel for how things are looking over the next 5 days. It's quite hard to appreciate, there are 8 boxes in there. Each box is a different region in Scotland, going from clockwise in the bottom left, all the way around the coast, from Dumfries and Galloway, round the north, and then back down to the Firth of Forth and Tay area. Within those boxes are the columns, which are 5 days. The numbers in that represent the values for each of the rows, and the rows include surge, how much extra water we're getting, what the wind speed and direction is, and what our wave heights and directions are. So a really good overview of what's coming up in the next few days that helps us both plan our own work as duty officers and looking at the rota and the resourcing of the rota if things are going to get busy. And then on the right are the regional areas that we issue flood alerts for. And I should really have a little slide in there with an example of flood alert. But flood alert is fairly generic. It will highlight that flooding may occur within that area, and it covers all sources, including coastal. Okay, getting down into the more detailed coastal flood forecasting now. We have 7 schemes currently, which make up that national service at the moment. They have come in at various times, and I can't actually read the numbers on my screen because they're really small. But the first one, I believe, was the Clyde back in 2009. Oh, sorry. And the most recent new scheme that we've launched was the Elan Sour, the Outer Hebrides scheme in 2020. We're currently in the process of recalibrating, which effectively means redoing the FOFAT, the Firth of Tay and Forth scheme, and that's due to be relaunched in 2027. So those are the schemes that we have. If we look at them in a little bit more detail, we have a part of the Solway scheme here on the left. The red shaded areas are the areas that we issue flood warnings for. And if we zoom into one of those, the bit in the circle is zoomed in there to show us a flood warning area called West Luce Bay South. And West Luce Bay South comprises two forecast points, Dromore and Kilstay Bay. The pie charts show the exposure, in which directions we expect the weather and the waves to cause issues with. And if either of these areas goes into flood warning, we'll review those and, if appropriate, issue a flood warning. When we issue a flood warning, the local authority can then just take action off the back of that. SEPA don't take actions in terms of road closures or gate closures or anything like that. We provide the information to the operating authority and they make the decision. Okay, that's the introduction done. So I'm going to move on to data and inputs and look at tides and water levels. Now, I mentioned UK CFF right at the start, the UK Coastal Flood Forecasting Partnership. And one of the things that it provides is the support, maintenance support for the UK tide gauge network that's currently done through National Oceanographic Centre. And on that UK map, you can see the gauges that we get data for in Scotland. That data is used by lots of different organisations for lots of different purposes, but it's the UK CFF that supports that. We also have a number of SEPA gauges shown by the green diamonds, I think they are there on the right. Then for waves, again, UK CFF support the a contribution to the WaveNet network, where we get our wave data. CFAS operate that on behalf of the partnership, and CFAS operate that on behalf of the partnership, and there are lots of additional wave recorder points in the south there, as they are part of the English Regional Monitoring Scheme. You can see there are quite a few gaps in Scotland. We're trying to close those, and maybe more on that later. And we've got an example of something which we've just very recently deployed in Brotaferry, a wave radar. So we're doing our best to start to close some of those gaps. We get our topography from LiDAR and from bespoke surveys that we carry out for flood warning schemes, picking up what the interface between the sea and the land looks like so that we can assess wave overtopping. I haven't got a picture in there of bathymetry. We get our bathymetry data as well from the UK Hydrometric Office and from OceanWise. There are fairly substantial gaps, I think, particularly in our nearshore bathymetry, which again we're trying to close, but that's ongoing work. We have a number of numerical models which feed inputs into the system. The Scottish Shelf model is shown in the UK map on the left, and the Elan Sour map on the top right is the sort of regional part of that. And we use other models as well, some which SEPA own. The other example in there is a European Marine Energy Centre model for Orkney. And we get astronomical data generated by the National Oceanographic Centre again. In terms of numerical surge models, we use the NEMO surge model from the Met Office. NEMO, now that's a really contrived one. Someone tried to fit it to their favorite Disney film. I'm going to have to check over my shoulder here for exactly what it was. It's the nucleus for European modeling of the ocean. So, but that provides us with that crucial elevated water levels that we need in order to do our forecasting. It's run on a 7-kilometer grid. It's run 4 times a day at midnight, 6 o'clock in the morning, midday, 6 in the evening, and it gives us, that really important additional water levels on top of what would normally be predicted. And then we have our wave models. We take in the WaveWatch 3 model outputs from the Met Office. That's a 7-day forecast at about an 8K resolution. It's an offshore wave model, so in order for us to use it, we need to transform those waves to the near shore, and we do that with a SWAN model. It's got a variable grid, so we can get more detail the closer you get inshore. And we tend to run these models offline several times and produce lookup tables, because the thing with flood warning is you want to generate numbers quickly, and these models can take some time to run. So that's the data inputs we have. I'm going to move on now to generating a forecast for any one of those forecast points. And we've got a wee schematic here of a typical coastline with properties built right up to the back of the seawall. So component 1, let's start with that. So component 1 is the data that we get in from the Met Office. So that's our WaveWatch 3 waves and our NEMO surge data. So we bring that in, we add that to our sea level changes. So that comes from different sources, depending on the scheme. It can come from models that are run online, models that are run offline. But we get that predicted tidal data added to the surge data to give our combined water level that we'll experience at any time. And then we take the offshore waves, we transform them with those SWAN models to get waves at the shoreline, and we do our wave overtopping calculations there in component 4. And it's that wave overtopping and those still water levels, total water levels, that we use to run our flood warning service primarily. The inundation mapping, that tends to get mostly used in our mapping, but it's also useful to make sure that we haven't missed any areas out when we're defining a flood warning area. So in terms of how all this mass of data is managed, we use a system called Fuse Scotland, Flood Forecasting and Early Warning System. It's a piece of software that's developed by Dutch company Deltaris, and that manages all those incoming data feeds and forecast models and spits the information out for the flood warning duty officers to interpret, and the flood forecasting hydrologists can look at those as well to do their pieces of work. We operate a twin fuse system internally in SEPA, so it's basically 2 models or 2 systems running side by side. And we also have a way of producing what are called web pages, which are summary outputs, and these are available to our partners, and we encourage partners who have access to those to make use of them. And I'll say pictures on the right, just to remind us, we're looking at still water, some still water level flooding from St Margaret's Hope here up in Orkney, and some wave overtopping in Stonehaven Harbour. So those are the 2 things that we are looking at primarily. So the fuse system doesn't make the decisions, the on-call duty officer does. They use the system, interpret it, and make those calls. This is the happy bunch of coastal flood warning duty officers here on a rare day trip to Troon with the Isle of Arran in the background. The reason they're happy is because on the right, Fuse is saying that everything is quiet. All of the areas we're forecasting for are that sort of, I don't know, yellow ochre color, which means there are no warning flags flying that day, so we can enjoy our time on the beach. Person front row, second from the left, will probably hate me for this, but Hazel, she does a tremendous amount of work in helping me to manage the rota team and make sure all that runs very smoothly. So she does most of the work actually. So big thank you to her. We access that information through the Fuse system. There are those multiple forecast points to be checked, and this is where the Met Office Outlook comes in really, really helpful, because it helps us to focus on the areas we might want to start in, and we check them for water level, and we check them for wave overtopping where we have the wave overtopping data. A not so happy day, when Fuse lights up. My granny used to have a Christmas tree with all the lights used to congregate in one corner of the Christmas tree, and sometimes this reminds me of that. But we have 229 coastal forecast points, covering 122 flood warning areas, so quite a big number of areas to monitor. As I said, they're all checked for their still water level against thresholds. They're checked for the wave overtopping, where we have that, and an assessment is made as to whether it's appropriate to issue a flood warning or not. So as well as issuing flood warnings, there are other actions in there, which may be to contact the local authority and give them a heads up that we're not issuing a flood warning, but there's going to be a bit of activity and they might want to gear themselves up or do some other actions. There's a whole range of things that local authorities do pre-flood warning. The Christmas tree on the right was from March 2023. 41 flood warnings were issued that day at the end. So I've got a sample of some of the outputs from Fuse here just to have a look at. So in the top left, we have a still water level forecast. Hopefully you can see the dashed lines at the top of that. These are the operational and flood warning levels. We're seeing the next 4 high tides there. One of those is exceeding flood warning, but only just. One of them is just below flood warning. So that's always a little bit tricky. It's always good, well not good, but it's always easier when something is way over flood warning because you issue a flood warning, nice and simple. But this maybe takes a little bit more work, and we can delve into the surge ensembles and look at the range of forecasts and look at the weather forecast and do some additional interpretation with knowledge of the sites themselves as well. So then on the right-hand side, this is one of those West Luce Bay sites. You can see hopefully there that in terms of still water level, we got loads of freeboard there, no worries at all about still water flooding there. But on the graph below, we have the wave overtopping, and we have a couple of tides where we're close to or exceeding those operational levels. And here they mean watch out, because these can change very quickly from not flood warning to well over flood warning. So that's a little warning sign, those ones. In terms of dissemination of flood warnings, we use a system called HTK Horizon, or a system called Horizon from HTK. They're used to issue warnings. Warnings can then be added to or extended through updates. When it's no longer needed, we issue no longer in force. And warnings they're geared mainly at the public and businesses and the likes. So they mainly contain information about areas that we are concerned about being at flood risk over the next few tides. We will try and explain the periods that we're worried about those impacts happening, what we think they will, it may impact, and whether waves are expected to be an issue or not. That's typical information we'll try and issue, and we try and tailor it to different communities so that people are getting the most useful information they can. We can communicate additional information to local authorities through this system, which we do, and that can be maybe a bit more information about exactly what's going on. Another event, I think it's our biggest one so far, but maybe not. April 24, we had 51 of our 122 flood warnings were issued across all 7 of the areas we provide warnings for. So coming to the last section here now around challenges and current issues. So with apologies to the meteorologists, I took what was quite a good image here and messed it up a little bit in adjusting it for this presentation. But what this is showing is the passage of a small low pressure coming in from the west, southwest. What we're concerned about here is forecasting for the Solway coast, which is where the yellow arrow is pointing to. And in one scenario here, we maybe have a forecast that suggests the low pressure is going to track over central Northern Ireland, pass over Belfast Lough and up into the Firth of Clyde. And in the other situation, which is maybe the next forecast, that's headed slightly further to the south, coming in over the northern part of the Republic of Ireland, across the Isle of Man and directly into the Solway. And here you can see, if you look at the wind direction arrows in there, really quite significant differences in the wind direction that we're going to experience for those 2 forecasts. So in one case, we're mainly having winds that are coming in from the southwest, and therefore those sites that are looking to the west and southwest will be affected. And the other case, we're looking at sites exposed to the east and southeast. Now, there are short fetches here, which means there's quite short areas for the wind to blow. And that means that waves can build up very quickly over a short period of time. There are also things about the timing in which that low comes through in comparison to the timing of high tide. And all of these things are variables that we try to manage when we're looking at those forecasts. But I'll be honest, they are tricky to work those out. So that's certainly a challenge. Some of the other challenges we have are around messaging and communications. Everybody loves a coastal storm. Well, not everybody loves a coastal storm, but what I mean is people love going out and taking fantastic pictures of the coastlines, of waves crashing over piers. Can be really, really dramatic. And you look at that and you think, oh, why haven't we got a flood warning out? Well, it's because this is, waves impacting on coastal structures. It's not necessarily causing flooding. So it's got to be very clear that what we're warning for is coastal flooding, not spray and waves. That can be picked up in the general flood alert, that there's likely to be a lot of spray and potentially debris around, being thrown over walls and on coastal roads. But it's not necessarily flooding, and we've got to keep our messaging really clean there. Coastal erosion happens during storms as well. Mentioned flying debris already, and structural damage. These can all happen and do happen when flood warnings aren't out, because we are warning for flooding. Scottish Government are a bit concerned about this, and they're looking at some trials through the Dynamic Coast project at the moment, which looks at how we would provide warnings perhaps to local authorities about when significant erosion and structural damage events may occur, and we're keeping in touch with that project, sharing information and seeing how how that might develop. But as things stand, that's beyond what we do with flood warnings, and we've got to be very clear in that messaging till things change, or if things change. And then just tiny little words in the bottom corner there with an exclamation mark is better evidence. We're always on the lookout for better evidence. That's what will drive improvements in the service. We have gaps in our wave data. We have gaps in our bathymetry, as I mentioned. What actually happens at sites when it's stormy, how much overtopping is really happening in reality. We do get some information from Facebook and other sort of platforms of people taking these videos, but sometimes they're out of context. You don't know at what state in the tide they were taken, etc. You don't know if it's a short clip, if that's typical, or it could be worse, could be not as bad. But gathering that information, these are some of the challenges we're really trying to focus on now. Okay, let's move on. Okay, sea level rise then. So I think when I started in the current role and mentioned sea level rise, we don't have to worry about sea level rise because we're forecasting for this week, not 50 years time. And I get the point. I really do get the point of that we're dealing with the present day when we're dealing with flood warnings. But in terms of how a service operates and how it'll continue to operate in the future, this is I think really, really important. And so another one of the scientists, Aoife Williams, did a bit of work for us on this, just to try and explore, okay, so what happens with sea level rise? What impact does that have on a flood warning service, in this case, the Coastal Flood Warning Service? So what Aoife did was she took a 15-month period between spring 23, summer 24, and during that period we had 193 exceedances of the coastal flood warning thresholds for still water level only. That's only for still water level. And we asked ourselves the question, if sea levels were higher, and we had the same weather occurring, how many more exceedances might we expect to get? And how we went about this, I think this has all come through in one slide, which is good. We take those deterministic still water forecasts that we have, and the top dotted line there in red is our current flood warning threshold. And basically for each site, we count the number of times the forecast crosses the flood warning level. We count that up all across all the sites for that whole period of time, and we came to that 192 number. And then what we did is we lowered the flood warning threshold by 100 millimeters, which is the same as sea level going up by 100 millimeters, and we recalculated. And you can see the numbers starting to change as you go up in increments of 100 millimeters. More of those high tides are crossing the thresholds. Aoife will want me to point out that we shouldn't be using these numbers as exact numbers. They are indicative of change, not what's going to happen in the future. And there are things that pull them both ways, so up and down. And remember, this is only for still water level. So what we then did was we plotted up a sample of those on this graph. And so you see we've got, how many have we got there? We've got 9 of our flood warning areas, ranging from the Solway in the southwest to Orkney, Eland Shower, Moray Firth, Firth Forth, and we looked at how those numbers would change. So to put it into context, there are 900 tides, high tides during that period, and the graph is not 500. So by the time you get to the top of the graph, you're looking at more than 50% of all tides. And what we're finding in some areas, particularly that Moray Firth area, Kingston, Orkney, Elanshire, we're seeing some quite stark changes in the number of times we're going to have to make decisions about issuing flood warnings. And if you move away from the extreme end of the graph, from the 1 metre end, because that's, is agreeably sometime in the future, we start looking at that 2, 3, 400 mil. That's not so far in the future. That's within the sort of planning time frame that we need to be thinking about for the service. And regardless of whether we're looking at lower high emissions, they're all heading for that in around about the same shorter period of time. So we've got to start planning for these rises in the service that we deliver. Summing all that up into one column on one table is quite a challenge, but I'll just move my cursor there so you can see that. So on the left, we have those 100 mil increments of sea level increasing, and in the orange on the right, we have the multiplier for the number of times, and we'll have to look at things. So with that 300 mil, 7 times more we will have to look at. And by the time you get up to that sort of 900 mil, you're looking at 100 times more. So the service is going to have to change. Something's going to have to give. In addition, there are other areas which we don't warn for at present, which we will likely be needing to warn for in the future. There's erosion to think about, where beaches are eroding and allowing waves to get closer to the shoreline. So there's lots of other things that mean that I actually think this might be slightly on the low side. So on that cheerful note, I'm going to come to some conclusions for you, and then I think we've got time for questions and so on. So coming into the role in the last 5-6 years, I can definitely see a lot of progress has been made in Scotland in our coastal flood warning in the last 10 to 15 years. We have moved on a lot with the introduction of these 7 coastal flood warning schemes and the creation of this National Flood Warning Duty Officer rota. So we're in a much better place, I think. But we do have a way to go, I think, still. We have those data gaps that I mentioned that are probably limiting the degree to which further improvements we can make. We need to take some time to consolidate our experience of issuing flood warnings and what's happening on site, and seeing if we need to make improvements or where we can make improvements. And to do that, we need to gather key evidence to drive those improvements forward. And we've started to have some quite detailed conversations around that. One mention on waves. One thing probably my colleagues know me for is boring them to death about the importance of wave data and wave buoys, and hoping that it's eventually paid off. With the help from Scottish Government, we've been able to purchase wave buoys to deploy at an extra 6 sites around the Scottish coast, starting this summer and into the autumn. The buoys are just coming off the production line in the Netherlands now, and hopefully will be arriving in the UK in the next week. Then they'll get set up and deployed and start giving us some of that valuable data. And we need to explore more opportunities for better collaboration, both internally and externally. So, we've gained a lot from working closer between the flood warning and the mapping teams. The latest flood forecasting upgrade we're working on for the Forth and Tay area, we're using the same wave model we used for the coastal map updates there, and that saved time and confusion and everything else. So we're getting some value out of that, but there probably is more value that we can drive out of those internal sort of collaborations. Externally within UK CFF, there's a great amount of expertise across different organisations we should be tapping into and looking to bring improvements and things like the NEMO surge model collaboratively. And then there's the big issue of technology, AI and machine learning, and how can we employ that to make a better, more efficient service. So one of my colleagues, Mike Cranston, has been working on those with researchers in the last year. So these are conversations that are all kicking off, and I think we're making progress on. But finally, I just want to really emphasize that threat posed by climate change. It's not just a coastal adaptation thing. It does affect our thinking about flood warning and how we provide it. It's a substantial change in the long term into what those risks are, and we need to be thinking about what our communities need from us, especially as there's a move away from protection of communities to communities being more flood resilient and more able to deal with floods when they happen. What different information do they need from us to be able to do that? And those are just some of the challenges that we are facing down the line, and I guess very much looking forward to taking on. Thank you very much for your patience especially with all the acronyms. I hope I've explained them all as I've gone along, and I think that's me finished, and I'll leave you with a picture of high tide in Kukubri.
Thank you, Steve. That was very thorough, really interesting, and great to see. We'll take some questions from the audience as always, and again online if you haven't already. Please put your questions in the chat bar, and we'll hopefully get to a few of them. My first question, just to start us off, I'm working in civil contingencies, and so by nature of that role, kind of interested in extremes and impact and impactful events. What do you see as some of the most impactful events, coastal flooding events in Scotland, and have we catered for it? Do we have an understanding of what's the kind of event that makes you keep up awake at night of what we perhaps haven't seen before?
Okay, yes, keeps me awake at night. So we had, I should remember the name of it, but we had a storm that hit the west coast. Was it last year, the year before? I think the Met Office issued a red wind warning for. Can anyone remember the name of that storm? Anyway, it hit the west coast, really severe wind speeds. It hit on middle and neap tides when water levels were really low. Colleague Colin did some analysis. What if that had hit on a spring tide? And we would have seen a very, very different outcome there. So yeah, we were lucky with that. So it's that spring tide, big surge, especially one that hangs around for a few days, and those really strong onshore winds all combining. And it can be made worse if you've got a series of storms, because a storm can strip a beach away. A beach provides protection to the wall behind. And so each storm that strips away a bit of beach can make the situation worse for the next storm that comes along. So that combination of spring tides, big surge, and waves being driven by strong winds. Yes, so
thank you. Any questions in the audience?
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting, Steve. Absolutely fascinating. One thing I just wanted to pick up on, you spent most of your talk about prediction and forecasting, and you made one or two references to evidencing what was actually happening. You mentioned once about taking some of that evidence from Facebook, for example, people taking local photographs. What do you actually do in the way of evidence? Because do you know what the percentage you get right, in effect?
Yeah, good, really good question. It varies, to be honest. So we work with local authorities as much as we can. And so, for example, in Kilstay Bay, which is quite a sensitive area, when we issue a flood warning there, the road gets closed, and that, you know, comes at a cost, both a financial cost to the council, but also a convenience to residents. It is an area where there have been fatalities in the past. And so when we issue warnings for that area, and sometimes when we haven't issued warnings for that area, we do get good feedback from the local authority as to what's actually happened on site. They'll send us photographs of, usually after the event, because you kind of don't want to be out during the event taking photographs, ideally, but showing, you know, debris lines on the road and, you know, was there impacts, was there not impacts? And we pull all that information together. You know, you could put a positive spin on it and say when everything works, no one complains. So I'm not sure that's fully correct, but I've always been concerned about the Ayrshire coast and the accuracy of warnings we issue there for places like Troon and Ayr. But you know, when we went there as a team, we didn't just go for the ice cream. We went and we talked to the local authority, and they showed us the areas that were impacted and how often they were impacted. And it was quite reassuring that actually, you know, we probably were better there than I thought. The flood warning team themselves have a program of gathering this information together. We have a log of model issues, which we report if the model doesn't replicate what reports we're getting back on site, and the team will go around to looking at that when they pull information together, or when the next recalibration of that scheme's coming up. We have a number of cameras that we can have access to. They're okay, they're quite good. You can look on them and you can see, for example, we've got a few in the Solway. You can see how's water come across the shoreline and onto the road. And so they're quite good for validating warnings, and we do use those, but we don't have anywhere near enough of those. Those are good for still water. Waves are another thing. If we had our way, we would have some of those arrays where you measure waves and wave overtopping at specific sites at the coast. I think it's the Cream Tea project, sorry, that has operated in Cornwall and other areas, where you're measuring exactly what's happening at a coastal frontage. I think the Dawlish railway line had one of those systems fit. We'd love to have one of those, but they're very expensive. So yeah, we get some information in. We don't get as much as we would want, to be honest. You know, we don't get feedback for every warning we issue, and I'm sure we don't get feedback for every time we maybe should have issued a warning when we didn't. But we gather what we can, and that's definitely one of the areas we want to pick up on. And you know, maybe there's something in citizen science there. I live in Stonehaven. Stonehaven's, you know, can be tricky. All through January, I think we only exceeded flood warning levels once or twice, and yet several tides water was coming over when probably a flood warning should have been triggered. Some of the shops, the ice cream shop, they take a daily video, you know, when it's stormy, and let people know if the ice cream shop's open or closed, and so we can pick that up. But maybe if we had some more interaction with them, we could get better information on exactly when they're taking it. Maybe we could put a fixed camera in so that we can, you know, examine that afterwards. But it all takes time and money, and we do have to prioritize things. So I'm not sure I answered your question that well, but some yes, some no. So,
any questions in the audience here?
Thanks, Steve. I was interested in the plot you showed of the effect of sea level rise on the number of coastal warnings that were would be issued with different levels of sea level rise. At what frequency of flooding does flood warning cease to become an effective action?
Yes, yeah, cracking question. So I imagine it's going to vary by site. So if you take Kingston, the threshold at which we issue a flood warning there is when the road starts to flood. Now that's the only road that connects those communities to the rest of Moray. I think there is another road around the back, but it's quite difficult to access. And so you could argue that that road could flood fairly regularly if properties aren't being affected, so long as people can then plan their daily journeys and so on. But when it's coming up to every other tide, then that is completely pointless issuing warnings for that. Maybe we up the threshold, so we say when it reaches a certain depth, the flood warning gets issued. But these are all the conversations we have to work our way through. I guess it depends on the accuracy of those warnings as well. If you issue a lot of warnings and they're accurate, then they're probably very useful. If you issue a lot and they're on the margins, then maybe people find that less useful. But I would say it varies. And we have to think, I think, increasingly in the future about flood warning not as an isolated service, but linked into coastal adaptation and coastal resilience building, and trying to tailor with communities how they can use the services that we provide to best effect. So,
got a few online. There's a mic there. Take a couple online.
The first question online is really, do you also consider precipitation and for total water height, and also strong winds? Does the model consider strong winds as well as just tides?
Yeah, so so we take those together. So the strong winds that will generate the waves, so that's partly built into the flood warning service where we have waves. Where we don't have waves, we will look at onshore wind conditions to see if that would change our decision on still water level overtopping or not. For rainfall, precipitation, there are areas, let's think of some, so Dumfries, there are areas there that can flood both from the river and from the sea, and combinations of the two. We have Riverside Drive on the Dee, which can flood from both, but usually a combination of high tides and high river levels. And the way we tend to work in that is we don't necessarily have them within the models, although the river models may or may not have that tidal limit working on them. But there are points where we will make contact with the river rotor for that area. And, we will feed information between us. What are the river levels looking? When are the rivers going to peak? What's the tides looking like? When's the water level going to peak? And is that combination going to cause a flood that we each individually aren't picking up? So there are areas where we do that. Probably, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 areas, the Clyde, the Spey, Kingston's or other ones where we have that interaction, but we're probably not picking it up as a joint probability event. And I'm aware that another impact to sea level rise is likely that those combined flood events are going to become much more frequent. And yes, yet another thing we have to think about is how do we deal with those combined events when we know that those are going to drive flooding more and more in the future.
So I guess that comes on to another question that's been asked about the impacts of climate change. Is there any observational evidence of changes linked to climate change? And if so, what are the main things that are changing? Just sea level or other factors?
So in terms of observational, yeah, that's that's doable. I can't pick out any particular information that because beach levels can change over time. Lots of things can change over time. In that chart, we did what if you lowered sea level by 150 mil? I didn't talk to that one, but let's say my granddad was doing this job with exactly the same tools when sea level was 150 mil lower, as a typical value for Scotland. He would have been, only doing 30% of the work that I'm doing. So, there have been those changes. But in terms of visibly, you get a lot of communities who you'll talk to, who will say, tide never came up this high as frequently before. It's hitting the wall more frequently. Is that erosion? Is that sea level rise? Not sure. I think if you looked for it, you would find it.
Maybe we can squeeze in one final question is, you mentioned the exact location of a cyclone on your forecast, and to what extent do you incorporate ensembles and probabilistic information into your forecast?
Okay, at the moment, we have surge ensembles, which we can look at, and we tend to interpret those when the deterministic is quite close to the threshold. We'll look at those and see if there's any case for issuing a flood warning there. We don't have those same ensembles for waves, although we'd like to explore how we would get those and then how we would use them, because I can imagine in many locations the ensemble is going to be quite wide given the variables that we're having to deal with. So to a degree, yes, but there are areas again there that we can do more on that front. I think we have the surges, we don't have the waves, so to a degree, I guess is the answer to that one.
Thank you. Well, we'll bring the questions to a close there. Can we thank our speaker one more time this evening? Thank you, Steve. Good to see everyone in person, and thanks for engaging of those online. As I say, our next talk will be in October, before which we'll send out our full program near the time. We'd love to see you all and have a good evening. Okay.